Chapter 1. The Forgotten Manuscript. The morning began as many did for Hercule Poirot, with the meticulous ritual of symmetry. He aligned his breakfast tray with a geometric precision that would have made a draftsman weep. Boiled egg precisely, centered toast triangles evenly stacked, and tisane steaming gently at exactly the right distance from his right elbow. London was already alive with the clatter of carts and the murmur of office-bound pedestrians. But within the well-ordered walls of Whitehaven mansions, serenity ruled. Poirot, however, sensed the tremble of change beneath the surface, like the faint tremor before an earthquake. And when the doorbell rang at precisely 8:45 a.m., 7 minutes earlier than his usual mail, he knew the day would not be ordinary. George, his loyal valet, entered the sitting-room with a frown tugging at his otherwise expressionless face. "Special delivery, sir," he said, offering a brown paper parcel. "No return address. Left by courier." Poirot's fingertips brushed the package with caution. The wrapping was thick, sturdy, tied with rough twine. No handwriting, just a small card tucked into the fold. On the card, a single line. "Every story ends, but not every ending is told." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Cryptic," he murmured, "and poetic. A dangerous combination." He untied the parcel with care and unfolded the paper, revealing an old book, battered and leather-bound. It bore no title on the cover. Inside, the first page was embossed faintly in gold. "Letters from a Lost Mind, Edward Linnell, 1905. He recognized the name, vaguely. A minor philosopher, dismissed by critics in his time, thought by some to have descended into madness. The book had long been considered a curiosity in intellectual circles, part allegory, part treatise, and entirely obscure. Poirot turned the final page, or rather, tried to. It was missing, torn out with precision. His eyes narrowed. "What do you make of it, sir?" George asked. Poirot did not answer immediately. He held the book aloft, testing its weight. The leather was real, the aging genuine. It wasn't a reproduction. "Someone has gone to great lengths," he said at last, "to ensure I receive this. But why me? And why now?" The answer came later that afternoon, in the form of a visitor. She arrived without an appointment, dressed in a trim charcoal suit with storm-grey eyes that matched the colour of the sky beyond the window. "Clara Fielding," she said, offering her hand. "Literary archivist. May I sit?" "Of course, mademoiselle." Poirot gestured to the armchair opposite. "You come in search of answers, perhaps?" "Or to offer them," she replied. "It depends how much you already know." Poirot smiled. I know that Edward Linnell published only one book, that he was declared mentally unwell by 1906 and disappeared from public life shortly after, that his final manuscript, the one meant to change literary theory forever, was lost, presumed, destroyed, and that this, he tapped the old volume, has had its last page removed. Clara nodded, clearly impressed. "Then you know more than most." "Let us say, I suspect." She leaned forward. "That page you're holding, it's not just the end of a book. It's a cipher, a code Linnell left behind. He wrote of a revelation too dangerous to be printed. But it was not destroyed. It was hidden. And I believe someone is trying to bring it to light." Poirot sat back, steepling his fingers. You intrigue me, mademoiselle. Tell me, why now? Why has this puzzle waited over a century to be solved?" She hesitated, then reached into her bag and drew out a photograph. Faded black and white. It showed a young man, slender, intense eyes, seated at a desk littered with papers. "Edward Linnell?" Poirot asked. "No," she said. "My grandfather. He was Linnell's student, and his friend. After Linnell was institutionalized, my grandfather claimed he smuggled out the last pages of the manuscript. He swore they contained something extraordinary, but no one believed him. They said he was mad too." Poirot studied the photograph again. "And you believe otherwise? I've dedicated the last 6 years to finding out," she said. "And I'm not the only one. There's someone else, someone dangerous, also searching, someone who wants the truth buried." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "Now it becomes clear. The page is not merely missing, it is contested." Later that evening, Poirot examined the book again. This time he focused not on the missing page, but the margins. Faint indentations. Inconsistent spacing. "There are ghosts in these pages," he murmured. "Someone wrote here once, then erased it." He sent for a chemical solution used in forensic ink restoration. Under the ultraviolet lamp, faint writing emerged, single words in the margin, like scattered puzzle pieces. Remembrance. Trust. No one. Halberd. Final voice. Halberd Bon Poirot knew the name. Rupert Halberd had been a literary critic in the early 1900s, a staunch defender of traditionalist values. It was Halberd who had publicly denounced Linnell's theories as dangerous delusions. If Halberd had reason to fear Linnell's final page, might he have suppressed it? He made a note to visit Halberd House the following day. Halberd House stood like a tombstone atop Hampstead Hill, its grey stone facade worn by time, but proud in posture. The current owner, Sidney Grace, was Halberd's great-nephew and a successful publisher in his own right. Grace welcomed Poirot into the drawing-room with the practised charm of a man used to media attention. "So, you've found the ghost manuscript," he said, pouring a drink. "Clara Fielding's been sniffing around here too. I admire her passion, but that girl has romanticized Linnell far beyond reality." "You don't believe in the missing page?" Poirot asked. "I believe there was a page. I also believe it was nonsense. My great-uncle was no saint, but he wasn't a criminal either. He genuinely thought Linnell had lost his grip." Poirot eyed him carefully. "And if the page contained a critique not of theory, but of power? If Linnell was silenced not for madness but for heresy?" Grace's smile faltered. "You've been speaking to Clara." Poirot stood. "I have spoken to the evidence. It whispers quite clearly once you listen." As he left Halberd House, he noticed something strange. A painting in the hallway. A chapel ruin. The same ruin that had appeared in the background of a photograph included in the original package. A location. A clue. There was, he knew, more than one kind of truth. One lived in books, recorded by ink and binding. Another lived in silence, the silence of those erased, disbelieved, conveniently forgotten. Poirot stood at the window, watching London breathe. Beneath the dusk, this was no ordinary mystery, this was a war of words, and history had chosen its winners long ago. But Hercule Poirot was not one to be satisfied with victors. He sought justice. even for the dead. Chapter 2. Shadows of ink. The following morning, Hercule Poirot rose earlier than usual. Sleep had not claimed him easily. His mind turned the mystery like a Rubik's cube. A manuscript, a torn page, a vanished philosopher, and a growing sense that something more than literary curiosity was at stake. That Clara Fielding had come to him, rather than a journalist or academic, confirmed as much. She knew the trail would not be paved with footnotes, but with footprints of those who had something to lose. At precisely 6:31 a.m., Poirot began his methodical toilette. Even in haste, there must be order. Moustaches received their customary attention, waxed into their upward crescents. His shoes gleamed. By 7:15, he was seated, a cup of tisane in hand, a notebook open before him. There were facts to arrange. Clara Fielding had been researching Linnell's work independently for 6 years. Her grandfather, Desmond Vale, had claimed to possess the final page, then vanished from public life in the 1950s. The manuscript Poirot received bore signs of a second reader, marginalia, later erased. The word halberd had appeared repeatedly, clearly referencing Rupert Halberd, Linnell's fiercest critic. Poirot had seen in Halberd House a painting of a chapel ruin, identical to the one in the photograph sent anonymously with the manuscript. Coincidence? No. Clue. Poirot's next step was clear. He would visit the ruin. The chapel stood on the outskirts of Surrey, reachable only by narrow paths and uncooperative signage. The land had once belonged to the Halberd estate, though much of it had since been sold off. Overgrown hedgerows clawed at the narrow road, and mist curled low over the fields, as if protecting the ruin with a shroud of secrecy. Poirot's driver, ever discreet, waited at a respectful distance as Poirot stepped through the iron gate and approached the remnants of the chapel. The roof had long since collapsed, and ivy snaked across the crumbling stone. Birds scattered as he walked, the air disturbingly still. And then he saw it, the altar, just as in the photograph. A single lily rested upon the cold stone. Fresh Poirot bent to examine it. Beneath the flower lay a card, handwritten, elegant on thick cream stock. Not all absences are voids. Some are intentional erasures. Keep looking, Monsieur Poirot. No signature. He scanned the surroundings, but saw no sign of another soul. Whoever had left the flower had done so recently and silently. He turned his attention to the altar itself. Something about the stone surface seemed wrong. Too smooth in the centre. Poirot brushed away the dust. His fingers found a groove, barely detectable a seam. Within moments he had uncovered a false panel. It gave way with a soft click, revealing a narrow cavity inside. He reached in carefully and withdrew a weathered envelope. It was sealed with wax, the crest, a broken quill. Inside were 3 items: a single page of typewritten text, a short handwritten note, and a folded photograph. The note read, "If you are reading this, you are closer to the truth than most. But truth alone will not protect you. My grandfather died for this page. Decide if you will live with it or die for it." C.F. Clara. The page itself was a fragment of manuscript, clearly the final page from Letters from a Lost Mind. It read like a manifesto. And so I say, ideas, once born, cannot be unthought. They may be burned, buried, redacted, but they remain in the crevices of culture, in the overlooked footnote, in the last page no one is meant to find. Truth is not madness. Madness is the refusal to see the truth once shown. It was dated 1906. The photo enclosed showed a younger Desmond Vale, recognizable from Clara's earlier picture, standing beside a man in a lab coat. Behind them, a gate with the inscription Crestwood Asylum for the Mentally Infirm. Poirot studied the image with intense focus. Crestwood, he murmured, where Linnell was taken. He stood in the chapel, the manuscript page in hand, and felt the air shift. This was not a mere game of intellectual legacy. Someone had died protecting this page. Someone else had tried to erase it, and failed. And now it was his burden. By the time Poirot returned to London, dusk was falling. George greeted him with his usual efficiency. Miss Fielding rang 3 times, sir. She left no message but said it was pressing. Shall I put her through now? No, I shall call upon her directly. Clara lived in a modest flat near Chelsea Embankment. Poirot arrived just after 7. The hallway was quiet. A woman in curlers peered at him from a neighbouring doorway as he knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still silence. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Miss Fielding? He called gently. No reply. He stepped inside. The flat was in disarray. Drawers open. Papers scattered. A desk overturned. Clearly someone had searched it, hurriedly, and with little concern for concealment. On the floor near the desk lay Clara's notebook. Poirot picked it up, flipping through the pages. Notes on Linnell's life. Cross-references to Halbert's writings. A crude map of the chapel. And in the final pages, references to a second location mentioned in one of Vale's recovered letters. Poirot's eyes widened. A phrase had been underlined multiple times. The orchard room. Suddenly, from the back of the flat, a sound, a creak, floorboards. Poirot froze. Then quickly stepped into the hallway and withdrew, closing the door silently behind him. He waited in the stairwell. Moments later, a figure emerged. A man tall, wearing a trench coat and a cap pulled low. He did not see Poirot as he exited onto the street and disappeared into the fog. Poirot exhaled. He returned to the flat, ensured Clara was not present, and found no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. She had not been harmed here, but she had been watched, and now taken. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot sat by the fire. He had retrieved what the intruder had missed. Clara's hidden USB stick, taped beneath a drawer. On it, scans of the manuscript, notes on Vale's coded letters, and a draft of a paper Clara had titled The Manufactured Madness of Edward Linnell. It was brilliant and damning. It suggested that Rupert Halberd and several contemporaries had orchestrated Linnell's institutionalization to suppress the ideas he proposed, ideas that undermined the very structure of class and intellectual elitism in Edwardian England. Poirot stared into the fire. This was no longer about a page. It was about power, suppressed, protected, preserved, and now, once more, under threat. He picked up the final page, read it again. Madness is the refusal to see the truth once shown. And then he whispered almost to himself, if Clara has been taken, She will not be silenced so easily. Chapter 3. The orchard room. It was not until the following morning that Poirot began to piece together the meaning behind the orchard room. Clara Fielding's notes had referenced it repeatedly, always in quotation marks, always in tandem with her grandfather's letters. She had even underlined the phrase with almost frantic pressure, as though she had finally uncovered its significance before vanishing. Poirot, seated once again at his desk in Whitehaven Mansions, reviewed Clara's files stored on the USB stick. Most were scanned documents, carefully catalogued. One folder bore the title Vale Archive, unpublished. Inside he found a letter, dated 1957. The orchard room is not on any blueprint. You must know to ask for it. Even in Creswood's heyday, only a few of us were allowed inside. That's where they kept what couldn't be treated or controlled. I warned them, and I kept the pages, the final ones, for Edward's sake. D.V. Poirot narrowed his eyes. If this orchard room still existed, it would be at Creswood Asylum, long since decommissioned, boarded up after a fire in the 1970s. It had remained mostly untouched, since protected only by rusted gates and fading trespass signs. Poirot disliked physical danger. He disliked dust even more. But the truth called. Creswood stood on the edge of a forgotten county line, shrouded in overgrown trees and decay. The building loomed as a silhouette against grey skies, windowless, silent, patient. He had made arrangements with Scotland Yard, who owed him more than a few favours. An officer named Inspector Marsh met him at the iron gate with a flashlight and a crowbar. "Bit grim, this place," Marsh muttered as they walked. "No power, no records, not even a caretaker. Are you sure this has something to do with a manuscript?" "More than you know, mon ami," Poirot replied, stepping carefully over roots and debris. "But yes, words in the wrong hands are more dangerous than bullets. Inside the asylum was a tomb. Graffiti scarred the walls, floors groaned, mould clung to corners like an illness that had never been cured. They passed long corridors lined with patient rooms, small, identical, lifeless. Then Poirot stopped. Door ahead bore no number, no plaque, just faint outlines of old paint, where once a name might have hung. This, Poirot was sure, was the orchard room. Marsh forced it open. The room was large, larger than expected. At its centre stood a reinforced chair, leather restraints still intact. Shelves lined the walls, many empty, others stacked with decaying notebooks and medical files. Poirot crossed to a filing cabinet and opened a drawer. Inside, yellowed papers, some stamped with the seal of the Crown, others bearing the name Dr. R. Halbert. "This is it," Poirot said softly. "This is where Linnell was held." Marsh frowned. So the philosopher was a patient? "No," Poirot said. "He was a prisoner. There is a difference." He opened one of the files, marked Patient EL. The handwriting inside was tight, obsessive. He read aloud, "Subject remains defiant, refuses to recant claims regarding ideological inversion, has begun using allegory and metaphor to communicate with orderlies. Diagnosis, functional delusion with literary transference." Marsh peered over his shoulder. Sounds like they were trying to discredit him. Exactly. And Dr. Halberd led the effort. Poirot opened a second drawer, and there, tucked between reports, was a sealed envelope marked simply for Edward. Inside was a letter, folded around something harder, metal. The letter read, "My friend. If you ever read this, it means they failed to bury you completely. The lockbox at Gresham Bank remains untouched. Your final chapter awaits. Use the medallion. It's encoded to your voice." Enclosed was a brass disc, etched with a strange pattern, almost a circuit. Poirot turned it over. On the back, one word, Linnell, a voice-encoded key. Poirot's heart quickened. Gresham Bank, a private institution, anonymous safekeeping. He would go there next, but first he returned to London. By the time he arrived, another envelope was waiting at his flat. No return address. Inside was a single note. "You are looking in dangerous places, Monsieur Poirot. Some pages remain missing for a reason. Stop turning them." Poirot read the message thrice before folding it. Whoever had written it wanted him to stop, but had not tried to harm him. That, in itself, was curious. A warning, not a threat. Perhaps they wanted to scare him off without drawing more attention. He placed the note beside Clara's USB and the recovered medallion. And then, for the first time since she vanished, he called Clara's mobile again. Still no answer. But this time, the line did not go straight to voicemail. It rang once, then cut. Poirot stared at the phone. Someone had turned it on, briefly. She was alive, or someone wanted him to think she was. Gresham Bank was nestled discreetly on a narrow Westminster street, its facade classical, discreet, and unmistakably expensive. Poirot presented the medallion and the accompanying letter to the vault clerk. After a brief delay, he was led into the secure vault. The medallion was placed against a reader, and Poirot was prompted to speak. He mimicked the cadence of Linnell's voice, which he had studied from archived interviews. "Truth," he said slowly and evenly, "is not a luxury. It is a mirror, however cracked." A soft click. The vault opened. Inside was a single object, a leather-bound volume, stamped EL, and dated 1906. Poirot opened it carefully. The manuscript was complete, handwritten in Linnell's distinctive script. Notes in the margins, crossed-out sections, the final chapter, fully intact. He sat for nearly an hour and read. By the time he reached the end, his hands trembled. This was not just philosophy, it was prediction. Linnell had foreseen the manipulation of truth, the rise of selective memory, the weaponization of madness as political erasure. He had named names, institutions, ideologies, all encoded in metaphor, but unmistakably real, and they had locked him away for it. Poirot closed the manuscript and stood. He now held what many had tried to destroy, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it never saw the light again. That evening, as fog blanketed the city, Poirot returned home. He found his door slightly ajar. He stepped inside, cautiously. Nothing appeared out of place until he reached the study. The manuscript was gone. So was the medallion. On his desk, a Polaroid photograph, Clara, blindfolded, hands bound, and a single line written in black ink, "Trade truth for her." Poirot stared at the photograph. The game had changed. It was no longer a mystery. It was a war. Chapter 4. Ink and Ashes. The fire in Hercule Poirot's hearth had long since gone cold, yet he sat unmoving, the photograph of Clara Fielding resting on his knee. Her face was obscured by a blindfold, but her mouth, slightly parted, taut with fear, spoke volumes. The message had been delivered with cruel efficiency, her life for the manuscript. Poirot's mind, ever ordered, began to sort the facts. First, someone had entered his flat without forcing the lock. Professional, surgical. They'd known exactly what to take. No rifling through drawers, no signs of a struggle. Second, they had allowed Poirot to see the photograph. This was not an act of random violence. It was a transaction, a demand. But unlike most ransom notes, this one came with no contact instructions, no deadline. It implied that they would choose the time. They controlled the narrative, but that was a mistake. Poirot stood abruptly and rang for George. "Have the constable on duty bring the building log," he said. "Every entry from today. I also require access to the security tapes from the lobby." George, unflappable as ever, gave a tight nod. "Shall I also call Inspector Japp?" "No," Poirot replied. "This is not yet a matter for Scotland Yard. It is a matter for discretion and for the little grey cells." Within an hour, Poirot was reviewing grainy black-and-white footage in the building's security office. Most of the day had been uneventful. Residents coming and going, a parcel delivery, a boy with a bicycle who lingered too long before being shooed away. But then, at precisely 3:17 p.m., a man entered the building wearing a delivery uniform, face mostly obscured by a cap. Shorter than average, carried a small box. He was buzzed in by someone on the third floor, not Poirot's. 3 minutes later, he stepped into the lift. At 3:21, he exited on Poirot's floor. At 3:24, he left, empty-handed. Poirot paused the footage. Zoomed. The patch on the man's sleeve was not for a courier company, but for Ashgate Press, a defunct publishing house that had gone bankrupt over a decade ago. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "A ghost press." He jotted it down. If someone was using Ashgate as a front, it suggested not just a knowledge of literary history, but a twisted sense of irony. Poirot's next destination was the London Library. While many of his colleagues preferred direct confrontation, Poirot believed the truth lay in records, not recklessness. Ashgate Press had published exactly 2 volumes of Edward Linnell's work before folding. The second, Letters from a Lost Mind, had never been officially released. Only a handful of proofs existed. All were thought destroyed. He requested archival files. Within an hour, he held a ledger detailing the internal correspondence of Ashgate Press. Near the final entries was a note dated March 1907. Owing to increased scrutiny from legal authorities and the Ministry of Health, all remaining copies of Lost Mind have been surrendered. Lord Halberd requests that the proofs be incinerated in accordance with discretion clause. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Lord Halberd, not Dr. Halberd. He had suspected a connection between Rupert Halberd and Edward Linnell's erasure, but this confirmed that it reached further, into political influence. More striking still, the letter was signed by a C. Ashford Poirot's. Memory stirred. Clara Fielding's notes had mentioned a Christopher Ashford, an eccentric editor who had vanished shortly after the Linnell scandal. If Ashford had survived, or passed on the manuscript through a third party, then the truth had never been fully buried, only scattered, and now someone was burning to collect every piece again. Poirot returned home to find a second envelope slipped under his door. No threats this time, only an address. The Tallow Archive, Southwark, midnight. A trap, perhaps, but Poirot knew he would go. He arrived 10 minutes early. The Tallow Archive was a long-defunct warehouse, once used to store rare books, confiscated from closed or censored presses. Since the 1980s, it had fallen into private hands, allegedly purchased by an anonymous collector. Poirot knocked once. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and varnished wood. The shelves were immense, lined with books never meant for the public eye. Government-censored texts, banned pamphlets, literary ghosts. From the shadows, a voice spoke. "You've made quite a mess, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot turned. A figure emerged, mid-40s, well-dressed, angular features, and eyes sharp with calculation. He held a small black pistol loosely at his side. "You have me at a disadvantage," Poirot said calmly. The man smiled faintly. "You may call me Ashford. It's not my name, but it is one I've inherited." Poirot said nothing, letting the man continue. "You weren't meant to find the orchard room," Ashford said. "Certainly not the vault. That medallion was never for you. You left it in the ruin," Poirot replied. "A test? A temptation?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And Clara Fielding?" Ashford's smile thinned. "She's alive, for now. She's clever, but reckless. She believed exposing the full manuscript would enlighten the world. But knowledge without guidance is like fire in a dry forest. It consumes more than it reveals." "And so you consume it instead?" Poirot asked. "I protect it," Ashford countered. "There are truths in Linnell's writings that fracture minds. That's why he was institutionalized. That's why his final page was meant to be the last page." Poirot took a step forward. "You say you protect truth, but you fear it. If Clara dies, you will have extinguished not just a mind, but a legacy." Ashford lowered the gun. "No, she will live if you help us. The original manuscript was digitized before you found it. You have access to that file. Give it to me, and she walks free." Poirot's voice was low. "And if I refuse?" Ashford did not answer. Poirot took a breath. "Then you must kill me now, because I will not stop." Ashford regarded him for a long moment. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped back. "Very well. A choice. You have 48 hours. Deliver the file to the enclosed address in Kensington. After that, Clara disappears. Forever." He handed Poirot a card. On it, nothing but an address. Poirot took it. "Remember," Ashford said as he turned to leave, "some books are unfinished for a reason." Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot returned to his desk, lit the fire anew, and stared at the USB drive containing Clara's research. So this was the shape of the puzzle. Not a murder, not theft, but an intellectual suppression so complete that it masqueraded as madness. Poirot tapped the card against his palm. He would not give them the file, but he would give them something else, something unexpected. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Ink, Hercule. Poirot sat at his desk, fingertips pressed together, deep in thought. The fire cast a wavering glow across the study, illuminating the objects laid carefully before him. The USB drive containing Clara Fielding's digitized research, the Kensington address card handed to him by the man calling himself Ashford, and a red leather-bound notebook embossed with a simple EL. He had read the full manuscript once. That was enough. Its ideas were dangerous, but not because they were mad. They were precise, logical, and damning. Edward Linnell had anticipated not only the collapse of philosophical inquiry into propaganda, but had named, if obliquely, the very institutions that had erased him. To release it, unedited, would be a moral gamble, but to give it to Ashford would be a surrender. Poirot did not believe in gambles. He believed in plans, and plans began with clarity. The next morning, Poirot visited a small antique bookshop tucked between a baker and a locksmith on a narrow street in Bloomsbury. The shop was run by Miss Aurelia Trent, a former codebreaker during the war with an encyclopedic knowledge of rare texts and a sharp tongue. She greeted Poirot with a wry smile. "I've seen that look before, monsieur. You're planning something inadvisable. I require your skills," he replied. "Discretion is assumed." She arched an eyebrow. "Go on." Poirot retrieved a second USB stick, one Clara had not used. He had created a carefully edited version of the Linnell manuscript, faithful to the tone and structure, but with certain names and passages strategically redacted or reworded. He handed it to her along with a second item, a worn first edition of Plato's Republic, its margins filled with annotations by Edward Linnell himself. "I need you to insert this text subtly into a selection of older academic texts. Blend it in, make it appear incidental, as though it has always been there." Aurelia nodded slowly. "And then you want it discovered later?" "Not yet," Poirot said. "First, I will deliver the copy to our friend Ashford. Let him believe he has won. That will buy us time. And the real file? Locked away, but not forever." She looked at him carefully. "You're planning a false revelation." "I am planning a distraction," Poirot corrected, "until we are ready for a true one." 2 nights later, Poirot arrived in Kensington, a briefcase in hand. The building at the address was modern, nondescript, its door opened by an expressionless woman in black gloves. She led Poirot to a quiet room where Ashford waited, still impossibly composed, like a man who never doubted the outcome of his own game. "You're early," Ashford said. "I am efficient," Poirot replied. He set the briefcase on the table. "You will find the drive inside. Clara." Ashford gestured to the far wall. A monitor blinked on. A video feed displayed Clara, seated in a dim room, hands unbound, a bottle of water beside her. She was pale, tired, but very much alive. Ashford tilted his head. "She will be released within the hour, once the file is verified." Poirot inclined his head. "Then I await your word." Ashford reached for the briefcase and withdrew the drive. He held it to the light. "You didn't make copies?" Poirot smiled faintly. "But of course, I made copies, and I destroyed them, except this one, naturally." Ashford inserted the drive into a sleek silver laptop. The files opened without hesitation. He scrolled slowly, paused, scrolled further. Poirot could see it, the slight narrowing of the man's eyes. the frown that formed slowly as he began to notice what was missing. The metaphorical teeth were intact, but the venom had been siphoned away. "This isn't the original," Ashford said, voice dangerously quiet. "No," Poirot agreed. "It is better. It is safer. The ideas remain. The names do not." "You altered a historical artifact," Ashford said. "I preserved its purpose," Poirot replied, "not its casualties." Ashford stood. Then the girl will still be released, Poirot said, "because if she is not, then I assure you, the real manuscript will be broadcast to every university in Europe before dawn." Ashford studied him. "You'd risk that? I do not bluff, monsieur, but I am also not without mercy." A tense silence passed. Finally, Ashford nodded to the woman in gloves. She exited. "You've bought yourself time, Poirot," he said, "but this story is far from over." "I should hope not," Poirot replied. "The truth is not a page. It is a novel, and we are still in the middle chapters. Clara Fielding was released near Hampstead Heath just before sunrise. Poirot retrieved her personally. She looked thinner, paler, but unbroken. In his flat, wrapped in a blanket and sipping cocoa, she finally spoke. "You found the final chapter?" Poirot nodded. "I did." "And you didn't publish it?" "I amended it." She stared at him. "Poirot, that manuscript, it was his voice, his truth." "And I honour it," Poirot said gently. "But I also protect it. The world must be made ready first." Her voice dropped. "You're afraid." "I am cautious," he replied. "I am also very tired." They sat in silence. Then Clara reached into her coat and pulled out something Poirot did not expect. A second USB stick. He stared. "I made a copy too," she said quietly, "before you ever found the manuscript." Poirot blinked. "Mademoiselle, you are full of surprises." She gave a faint smile. "You taught me well." He leaned back and laughed, genuinely, softly. "Aha, perhaps I did." That night, Poirot wrote a letter to be held in reserve. "To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, then truth has emerged, but not as expected. Edward Linnell's manuscript was never truly lost. It lived in fragments, in minds, in margins, in footnotes disguised as fiction. The final page is not an end. It is an invitation. Do not fear the missing pieces. Fear those who pretend the puzzle was never meant to be solved." Hercule Poirot, he sealed it and locked it away. There was more to uncover, more shadows to chase. But for now, the ink had stopped flowing, and the page, for the moment, had turned. Chapter 6. The forgotten witness rain streaked the windows of Whitehaven mansions like ink running on parchment. Outside, the city moved in, its usual rhythm, buses hissing to a stop, umbrellas bobbing across sidewalks. But within Poirot's flat, all was still. Clara Fielding sat curled in the corner armchair, staring into the fire. It had been 3 days since her release. Poirot, despite urging her to rest, knew the restless pulse of an unfinished mystery beat just beneath her quiet exterior. She looked up. "You still haven't asked me the most obvious question." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And what question is that, mademoiselle?" "Why I copied the manuscript." He set down his cup of tisane and folded his hands. I presumed you did so out of fear, that it might vanish again, or perhaps defiance, to preserve what so many sought to bury. Clara shook her head. Not quite. She leaned forward, voice low. There's something I never told you. Something I couldn't tell anyone, not even in my notes. Poirot's interest sharpened, though he gave no outward sign. Clara continued. The copy I made, it was not just of Linnell's manuscript. It included something else. A letter, tucked into the last pages, addressed not to the reader, but to someone named Jonas. Poirot straightened. This name, it was not in any of the recovered papers. Clara nodded. Exactly. That's what made me curious. Linnell wrote as if Jonas was alive, waiting for him. The tone wasn't paranoid. It was intimate, like a brother or a close friend. Poirot stood, already reaching for his notebook. You remember its contents? Not entirely, she admitted, but enough. He mentioned a place, Barrow Hill Asylum. Poirot paused, pen in mid-air. That institution was closed in 1913. Clara nodded. Yes, supposedly condemned for structural instability. But Linnell wrote that Jonas had been hidden there, not committed hidden. He said, the last witness is not mad, but made to seem so. They stole his name, but not his mind. Poirot tapped the pen against his lip. Fascinating. If Jonas exists, if he was a witness to what led to Linnell's incarceration, then he may hold the key to why this manuscript has been so ruthlessly suppressed. Clara hesitated. I know it sounds like a dead end. A century-old asylum. A man who may be long dead. No, mademoiselle, Poirot said, standing with sudden resolve. It sounds like a trail. Faint, yes, but Poirot has followed fainter. Barrow Hill was a grey husk of stone and shadow, perched on a hill just outside Surrey. The drive there was long and wet, and by the time Poirot and Clara arrived, their boots sank into the mud like quicksand. A rusted gate marked the entrance, its sign twisted by time, Barrow Hill Institute for the Afflicted and Unquiet Mind. Poirot's contact was already waiting. An elderly man named Cyril Fenley, former city archivist, whose passion for abandoned institutions had made him an expert on forgotten places. He greeted them with a nod and a worn satchel. I brought what I could find. Blueprints, ledger copies, some personnel files. Most of it was supposed to be destroyed after the closure. But well, he smiled. Archivists never burn anything unless you pry it from our hands. Inside, the asylum was a mausoleum of forgotten lives. Paint peeled from the walls in great strips. Graffiti mingled with decades-old medical notices. Somewhere in the dark, a bird flapped its wings and vanished into the rafters. Poirot moved slowly, carefully, reading the building as if it were a case. Tell me, he said to Fenley, was there ever a wing or annex not listed in public maps? Fenley nodded. Yes, East Wing sub-level. Access restricted even to most staff. Officially sealed in 1909. Can we get there? It'll take some climbing. He wasn't wrong. They descended 2 levels by stair, then through a maintenance tunnel nearly choked with debris. At the far end was a thick iron door, padlocked. Fenley produced a ring of antique keys. I can't guarantee this still works. Click. It did. The room beyond was a chamber of dust and echoes. Shelves of patient records lined one wall. Decayed furniture sat in mournful stillness. But it was the far end of the room that caught Poirot's eye. A single metal bed, its frame rusted, beside a wooden chest half swallowed by shadow. Clara reached it first. The chest creaked as it opened. Inside were dozens of folded papers, drawings mostly, faces, eyes, pages filled with spirals, like the mind had tried to draw thought itself. And then, in the bottom, a leather notebook. Poirot opened it carefully. The first page read, Jonas, Mallory, admitted 1903, not ill, only afraid. Clara looked over his shoulder. So he was real. Poirot flipped through the entries. They were coherent, though filled with strange metaphors. One stood out. They erased me like ink with acid. Said I never testified, but I remember Edward. I remember the man with the cane and the coin in his eye. The page was not empty. It was taken. Poirot's fingers froze on the phrase, coin in his eye. Clara stared. That's in Linnell's manuscript too. Page 7. The man he feared most. Poirot closed the notebook slowly. Then we have a witness, not just to the suppression of the book, but to the events that led to Linnell's destruction. He turned to Fenley. This notebook, was it catalogued? Fenley shook his head. This room wasn't even known to exist. You're the first people in here in over 70 years. Poirot's eyes glittered. Then this is our leverage. Ashford claims to protect truth, but he fears testimony. He fears memory. Back in London, Poirot sent copies of Jonas Mallory's writings to 3 locations: a literary journal in Vienna, an academic newsletter in Oxford, and a private philosophy club in Edinburgh. He included no name, no explanation, only the phrase, testimony discovered, believed lost, Barrow Hill, 1903. Let Ashford chase shadows while the real trail widened. That evening Clara placed the notebook beside the fire. He wasn't mad. He was buried. Poirot nodded, and now unearthed. She looked at him carefully. You know, this is no longer just about the manuscript. Oui, Poirot said softly. It is about restoring a voice, and proving that history cannot be edited with fire. The rain had stopped. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, as if even the air approved. Chapter 7. The man with the coin, the man with the coin. The phrase had lingered in Poirot's mind like an echo in a long corridor, a symbol without a name. Both Edward Linnell and Jonas Mallory had mentioned him, always obliquely, always with fear, a man who never appeared in official reports, who left no trail, yet whose influence threaded through every vanishing and every silence. Clara, hunched over the old asylum notebook in Poirot's sitting room, reread Jonas's entries with increasing intensity. Listen to this, she said, pointing to a passage near the middle. He wears the silver coin on a chain, shows it like a badge when they ask him nothing. I heard Edward say once, he's not government, he's consequence. Poirot stood still for a moment, then reached for his book of press clippings, carefully organized by date and subject. From a folder labeled Intelligence Obscure, he pulled out a photograph from 1931. A man, just out of focus, stood at the edge of a crowd at an academic conference in Prague. Grey suit, gloved hands. and around his neck, faintly glinting. Coin-shaped pendant. Poirot handed it to Clara. He appears in at least 3 more photographs, always at events involving intellectual controversy or suppression, always just present. Could he be a government agent? She asked. If so, he is one who has survived far too many regimes without changing his methods, Poirot replied, which makes him something more dangerous. A private authority mistaken for a public one. Clara frowned. Then what's his goal? Poirot considered. To prevent certain truths from reaching the public. Truths that may destabilize something. Perhaps not society, but a framework. Political, ideological, or even economic. He tapped the photo. We need to find his name. And for that, we need someone who remembers the last man to confront him and live. Poirot's search brought him to the British Library's restricted archives, where he met with Dr. Eleanor Voss, a former academic who had once co-authored a controversial paper with Edward Linnell. She had vanished from public life after 1954, citing academic fatigue. In truth, Poirot suspected it was fear. Dr. Voss was in her 80s now, sharp-eyed and suspicious. I've refused every interview request for 40 years, she said, greeting Poirot with a firm handshake. Why should I speak to you? Because I am not asking for your opinion, Poirot replied gently. Only your memory. She sat slowly, adjusting her scarf. You're here about the man with the coin. Poirot nodded. Voss's eyes darkened. He's not a myth. I met him once, in Berlin, 1949. I was presenting on post-war philosophical realignment. Edward had already been blacklisted. I quoted him without credit. He was that dangerous. After my session, a man approached me, never gave a name, just looked at me and held up a coin. It was Roman, I think, denarius. Then he said, some pages turn too sharply. They tear the binding. And walked away. Poirot listened silently. That night my luggage was searched, my passport flagged. 2 colleagues were suddenly removed from the university. No explanations, no charges. She leaned forward. I left academia within the year. And you never saw him again? No, but I heard the same phrase, whispered at conferences, the man with the coin. The unwritten rule was, never speak of Linnell, or he will appear. Poirot nodded slowly. Do you remember what he looked like? Only the coin, Voss said. It was the only thing that reflected light. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot spread his findings across the dining table like a general before battle. Clara stood beside him, eyes scanning the collage. Photographs, journal entries, redacted documents. I keep circling back to this phrase, Clara said. He's not government, he's consequence. What if that's not metaphorical? Poirot raised an eyebrow. Go on. Suppose he doesn't represent authority. Suppose he enforces a specific result, like a damage control mechanism. Not for one agency, but for many. An institutional janitor. Poirot smiled faintly. You have the instincts of an excellent conspiracist, mademoiselle. She laughed, nervously. Is that a compliment or a warning? Both. He tapped a map. There is one more person who may help us. A man named Giles Trenwith. Once a political analyst, now a collector of dangerous stories. He runs a private salon in Hampstead, off the books but well attended. Clara frowned. Won't he be watched? Of course, Poirot said. That is why we shall attend anonymously. That evening, under cover of darkness and with hats pulled low, Poirot and Clara arrived at a discreet townhouse set back from the road. Inside, the atmosphere was more speakeasy than symposium. Low lighting, whispered debates, and an undercurrent of tension. Giles Trenwith greeted them with a glass of port and a raised eyebrow. "Ah, the detective without borders," he said, "and the young academic who vanished. What a delightfully dangerous pairing." "Delight is a strong word," Clara muttered. They spoke in a private room surrounded by shelves filled with banned books. Poirot wasted no time. "The man with the coin. Who is he?" Trenwith's smile faded. "You don't ask light questions, monsieur." Poirot waited. Trenwith sighed. "He's referred to by many names. The auditor, the binder, sometimes simply the curator. He's not just one man. He's a position, like a title handed down. The coin? It's the symbol of continuity. Roman origin, yes, but also an oath. An oath to whom? Clara asked. To history, Trenwith said, but a curated one. He intervenes when someone threatens to rewrite a version of history that benefits the silent powers behind progress. Poirot's brow furrowed. And you believe Linnell was such a threat? Absolutely. He wasn't just exposing inconsistencies. He was pointing out that the entire structure of accepted knowledge was constructed by the victors of silence. Clara whispered, so they erased him. Trenwith nodded, and anyone who tries to restore his voice may suffer the same. Poirot rose slowly. Then we must change the game. That night, Poirot drafted a letter, not to Ashford, but to the Yorkshire curator, anonymous, untraceable, but precise in tone. You have erased, but we have remembered. You have redacted, but we have reassembled. The coin spins only until it falls. We do not seek conflict, only light. Step out of the shadows. There is room for witness, even from those who once silenced. He left it in a drop box used by political dissidents. No signature, no return, only the message. 3 days passed, then, without warning, a single envelope arrived at Whitehaven Mansions. No name, no address. Inside, a photograph of Poirot and Clara entering Trenwith's townhouse, clearly taken from a distance. And on the back, 5 words, turn the page, or burn. Clara paled. Poirot held the photo a moment longer. Then he walked to the fire and dropped it in. No, he said calmly, we do not burn, we bind. Chapter 8. The hidden index the following. Morning. Poirot rose earlier than usual, disturbed not by dreams, but by a quiet certainty. The man with the coin was watching. That photograph had not just been a warning, it had been a declaration. The game had moved into a new phase. Every step now would have a shadow. Clara joined him for breakfast, bleary-eyed, the memory of the ominous message still fresh. You're not worried? She asked, pouring coffee with an unsteady hand. Ah, but I am, Poirot replied, straightening his cuffs. Which is why I shall proceed with greater precision, not hesitation. He gestured toward a stack of papers on the table. Last night I reviewed Linnell's original notes again. Do you remember his references to the Index Librorum Subditorum? Clara nodded. Yes, he called it the Catalogue of Silences. but I thought it was metaphorical. Poirot tapped the top page. Perhaps not. In the margins of the notes in nearly invisible pencil, he wrote a sequence. Ifsure, Chief, 38, Stonge. Not page numbers. Coordinates, I believe. But not geographical. Then what? Library references. Poirot stood. Come, we are going to Cambridge. The university's Wren Library was a monument to learning, and like all such institutions, it harboured more than it displayed. Poirot had arranged to meet Dr. Harold Quince, a bibliophile with a love of riddles and an unofficial key to the library's restricted holdings. Dr. Quince met them in a side corridor near a panelled alcove. "I'm risking more than tenure by showing you this," he said, unlocking a door hidden behind a false shelf. "Some books aren't banned, they're forgotten on purpose." They descended a narrow staircase to a chamber below the main archive. Dust motes shimmered in the beam of a single overhead light. Books lined the shelves in tight rows, bound in drab brown and grey, unmarked. Clara looked around. "What is this place?" "The suppressed collection," Quince whispered. "Not banned, not illegal, but too dangerous for circulation, either because of what they claim or who tried to bury them." Poirot opened a folder, revealing a handwritten catalogue. He ran his finger down the entries, then paused. There. He tapped an entry labelled Palimpsest number 18, LS Index Fragment. Quince frowned. "That's the one without author or date. No one has ever deciphered it, but it's stored under special seal, gold clasp, not the usual brass." He retrieved the book, a thin, ragged folio wrapped in velvet, and laid it, reverently, on a reading table. Clara leaned in. The pages were covered in what looked like overlapping scripts, Latin, Greek, even faint Arabic, scraped and rewritten dozens of times, but in the centre of one page, an unmistakable mark. A drawing of a silver coin with a laurel border. Poirot studied it silently. "Ink of 3 centuries," he murmured. "Overwritten knowledge. But Linnell must have seen it. And if he copied it..." Clara picked up a magnifying glass and scanned the page. Her eyes widened. There, beneath the drawing. Barely visible, but it looks like a cipher. A substitution grid. Poirot examined it, then smiled. "This is no random doodle. It's a hidden index, a concordance, cross-referencing lost texts across languages, eras, even pseudonyms." Quince looked nervous. "So it's real, then? The index of the subjugated. I thought it was just legend." Poirot turned the book carefully. "It is real, and I believe Linnell used it to track others who had been erased, like Jonas Mallory, like himself." Clara whispered. "Then this isn't just about a lost book. It's about a pattern, a network of suppression." Poirot nodded grimly. "Precisely." They left Cambridge under a grey sky, the stolen knowledge heavy in their minds. Back in London, Poirot began the slow process of decoding the cipher. For days he barely left his study. Clara assisted, cross-referencing ancient texts, former censures, and publishing records that had been redacted without explanation. What emerged was astonishing: names, dates, locations, each entry marked not by what was said, but by what was unpublished, prevented, or intercepted. Entire lifetimes of thought erased by a systematic, undocumented force. And in nearly a dozen entries, a single symbol appeared. A coin with a blindfolded figure on one side. Clara stared. They really were organised. Not just a person, but an order. Poirot rubbed his temples. We, a curatorship, passed from one to the next, each generation maintaining the illusion that what we know is all there is. He pointed to an entry marked D. Venn, 1922, Euston Station. And here, an unconfirmed incident involving a passenger bound for Paris, claimed to carry a memoir contradicting official war records. He vanished. Only a coin left behind. Clara sat back. It's like watching a ghost solidify. This man, he's not just a threat. He's a custodian of unreality. Poirot smiled thinly. And that, mademoiselle, is why he fears the light. For the truth is not a torch. It is a slow dawn. Late one evening, Clara returned from an errand with news. A letter, she said, holding up a small envelope. No name. But look. Inside was a single card. On it, a typed message. You have the index. You know the names. You have 3 days. Decide what you value more, peace or permanence. You are not the first to choose poorly. No signature, but at the bottom, an embossed seal of a coin. Poirot turned it in his hand. He grows desperate, he said softly. Before, he worked invisibly. Now he speaks. Clara swallowed. What do we do? Poirot smiled, though it was tinged with sorrow. We finish what Linnell began. We give voice not to one man's manuscript, but to every lost page. He looked toward the window, where dawn had begun to creep along the horizon. The time for concealment is over. Chapter 9. The Broken Bind. The early morning light filtered into Whitehaven Mansions like the first glimmer of a match in a long-sealed vault. Hercule Poirot stood at the window, immaculately dressed, eyes fixed on the slow churn of clouds above. London. Clara Hastings, seated at the table beside a stack of coded documents, watched him in silence. We have their names, she said quietly. Dozens of them. People who were made to disappear from the public record. Writers, scientists, activists, some forgotten entirely. Poirot turned from the window. Names, yes, but not yet their stories. And a name without its narrative. Mademoiselle is merely a placeholder in the silence. He sat beside her and opened the leather-bound folio containing the translated fragments from the Index Subditorum. A meticulous reconstruction, dates, locations, and citations from erased papers, each thread of knowledge interrupted either by mysterious retraction or suspicious vanishing. Clara leaned over the entry marked E. Linnell, final paper unpublished. This is it, she whispered, his last manuscript, the one he hid before being taken. Poirot nodded. According to the ciphered map in the index, it was deposited under an assumed name at a library vault in Geneva, not under Linnell, but under C. Rokesby, a pseudonym from his university days. But that vault's restricted, Clara said. Only international scholars with clearance can access it. Which is why I have written to an old friend who once worked at the League of Nations archives, Poirot said, handing her a carbon copy of a letter. He is discreet, and I hope loyal. As if on cue, the telephone rang. Poirot answered. Hullo? He listened, eyes narrowing. Merci. Yes, that will do. He hung up. Our request has been granted. The manuscript will be transferred to a neutral facility in Zurich under observation, but we must act swiftly." Clara looked nervous. "You think the curator will try to intercept it?" "I am counting on it," Poirot said calmly, "which is why we must ensure he intercepts the wrong one." They spent the next 24 hours preparing a replica manuscript, a forgery painstakingly designed to appear genuine. It included all the trappings, obscure references, Linnell's handwriting style, even false annotations made with vintage ink. "This will hold up to scrutiny," Clara said as she sealed the decoy in a leather folder. Poirot nodded approvingly. "Good. Then we shall arrange for it to be intercepted." He dispatched the decoy via diplomatic courier, a route carefully chosen for its vulnerability. Meanwhile, Poirot and Clara would travel separately, carrying the real manuscript hidden within a hollowed-out copy of The Tempest. The journey to Zurich was uneventful until the final station platform. A tall man in a dark coat approached as Clara stepped off the train. He walked with precision, too exact for coincidence. "May I help you with your luggage, mademoiselle?" he asked. Clara froze. Poirot, emerging behind her, smiled gently. "Non, merci. We have only one bag, and it knows how to travel." This man's eyes met Poirot's, and for a brief second the air tightened. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Clara exhaled. That was him. Poirot gave a slight nod. "The curator has made his appearance, which means we are nearly at the end." They reached the secure archive, a pristine room beneath a Zurich university, where an old friend of Poirot's, Herr Dr. Steinfeld, greeted them. "Ah, mon ami, always you arrive with storms behind you," Steinfeld said, "but I have your vault ready." Inside, Poirot carefully extracted the real manuscript from its hiding place. Clara stood silent as he opened the pages. The contents were as extraordinary as they were damning. Linnell had pieced together decades of deliberate intellectual erasure. Using correspondences, footnotes, and hidden academic records, he showed how specific theories had been systematically discredited, not because they were false, but because they challenged dominant power structures. But most striking was the final section, a direct reference to the man with the coin. "He exists in silence. He ensures silence, but not forever. One day someone will map the erased, and he will be known. History, unbound, will speak for itself." Clara placed a hand over her mouth. "It's like a confession, not of guilt, but of truth." Poirot closed the manuscript. "It is enough. Now we publish." They returned to London in haste, arranging discreet meetings with trusted journalists and academic contacts. Poirot made use of his considerable network. Old allies from former investigations, editors he once aided in delicate matters, even a few quiet hands in the British Museum. Clara worked tirelessly, organising a private exhibition titled The History That Never Was. It would feature documents, recovered essays, and a facsimile of Linnell's manuscript, an event hidden in plain sight under the guise of a historical lecture. On the evening of the exhibition, guests trickled into the lecture hall, academics, students, quiet dissenters. Poirot watched them from the back, a satisfied calm in his eyes. Clara stood at the front and addressed the crowd. "Tonight, we unveil not a discovery, but a recovery. What you see before you are fragments of thought, once buried, now brought back into the light. This is not about Edward Linnell alone. It is about all who were silenced for asking the wrong questions. Applause broke gently across the room. As the audience moved to examine the displays, Poirot noticed a man lingering at the exit. The same tall figure from Zurich. He wore a dark coat, and around his neck, faint beneath the collar, the glint of silver. Their eyes met. The man inclined his head, just slightly, then turned and walked away. Clara joined Poirot. That was him again, wasn't it? Yes. And he let it happen. Poirot nodded, because the moment has passed. To intervene now would draw too much light, and he, above all, fears the light. Clara exhaled, a tension long held finally easing. Then, it's over? Poirot looked out at the people milling among the displays. No, mademoiselle, it is beginning. That night, Poirot sat in his armchair with a cup of tisane. Clara, across from him, held the original manuscript in her lap. It's strange, she said. Linnell's final page, he left it blank. Just a title at the top. Appendix, the final witness. Poirot leaned forward. Perhaps he knew that someone else would write it. Clara looked at him. You mean us? Poirot smiled. You, mademoiselle, I am merely the facilitator. Clara looked down at the empty page. I'll start tonight. Chapter 10. The last page. It was raining softly in London. Not a thunderous storm, but a quiet, persistent drizzle that blurred the lamplight and made the city seem wrapped in fog and secrecy. Hercule Poirot stood beneath his umbrella at the corner of Tavistock Square, watching the slow procession of students entering the British Library. He had been invited, though unofficially. The Linnell manuscript, now authenticated and contextualized, was to be added to the public archive today. Not as fiction, not as theory, as historical record. Beside him, Clara Hastings adjusted her coat, her eyes fixed on the museum's stone facade. I keep thinking he should be here, she said quietly. Edward Linnell, seeing his work finally take its place. Poirot looked up at the sky. Ah, but he is, mademoiselle. He is on every page. It is not the presence of the man that matters now, but the endurance of his truth. They entered together, the hush of the library embracing them like a sanctuary. The exhibit hall was simple, no velvet ropes or fanfare. Just a glass case, a placard, and a bound volume of the manuscript now titled The Unspoken Histories, the Final Papers of Edward Linnell. Clara approached it slowly, her breath catching. It's strange, she whispered. I've read every word, transcribed every line, and yet seeing it here makes it feel more real than ever. Poirot smiled, because now it is no longer in our keeping. It belongs to the world. The last page has turned, not into silence, but into legacy. Later that evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot lit a fire and sipped his tisane in deep thought. Clara sat across from him, staring into the dancing flames. So, what now? She asked. Do we just go back to normal cases? Stolen jewels, cheating lovers? Poirot chuckled softly. Mon Dieu, those things have their charm. But no, I believe there are still echoes of this tale that remain. Clara frowned. You think the curator will return? No, he has receded, for now. His world depends on obscurity, not confrontation. He gambled and lost, but he is not the sort to disappear forever. He will wait for memory to fade, for interest to wane. Clara leaned forward. And will it? Poirot's eyes sparkled. Not if we tell the story properly. He reached for the original version of the manuscript, the one Linnell had hidden, now marked with Clara's handwritten annotations, and a final chapter added just that morning. You wrote it, he said, handing it to her. Clara took the book reverently and read aloud. Appendix. The final witness. Truth is not a weapon. It is not a flag or a creed. It is a bridge, often buried beneath rubble, but always there, waiting to be cleared. I did not know Edward Linnell in life, but I know what he gave up to protect this story. And now that I've helped complete it, I understand what it means to be its steward. We are not meant to win every battle, but we are meant to speak when silence is enforced. This is my witness. This is the last page. She looked up. Poirot was watching her, expression unreadable. I didn't know how else to end it, Clara said softly. Poirot stood and walked to the window. You ended it precisely, as it should be ended, with a beginning. Clara tilted her head. That doesn't make sense. Ah, but of course it does. Poirot turned back to her, suddenly animated. You see, the idea of a last page, it is a trick, a comfort. In reality, there is no final word, only the point at which one voice stops and another begins. Held up a small worn object, Edward Linnell's coin, the one left in Poirot's apartment, now cleaned and set in a simple wooden frame. I kept it, Poirot said, as a reminder that some truths are circular, that silence and speech, memory and forgetting are part of the same puzzle. Clara studied the coin. On one side, the laurel, symbol of false honour. On the other, the blindfolded face, expressionless, watching nothing. So what happens to him? She asked. The curator? Poirot looked into the frame. He becomes myth again, as he was before, a ghost in the records. But ghosts, as you know, mademoiselle, have a way of returning when least expected. There was a knock at the door. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Clara stood. You expecting someone? No. She opened it. A messenger in a rain-soaked coat handed her a brown parcel. For Monsieur Poirot, he said. No sender. Poirot took the package and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small book, bound in faded leather. No title. Inside, blank pages, save one near the centre, typed in the same unmistakable font as the earlier warnings. You've won one story, but not all stories. You are clever, Monsieur Poirot, but cleverness fades. I remain. See, Clara stared. He's taunting you. Poirot folded the page and placed the book on his desk. No, mademoiselle, he is reminding me. Of what? That this puzzle is not the only one. 1 month later, a small academic journal published a special edition titled The Forgotten Word, Silenced Thinkers of the 20th Century. Inside were essays from young historians, archivists and researchers, all inspired by the Linnell manuscript and the strange story surrounding its recovery. Clara Hastings's essay was the centerpiece. She titled it simply, The Mystery of the Last Page. Poirot read it in full, then placed it gently into his case files. not undersolved, but underimportant. On a spring morning in Brussels, an elderly librarian opened a forgotten box from the 1930s. Inside, a stack of letters, unsigned. Each referred to a different author who had vanished from public record, and at the bottom of the box, a silver coin. No one knew how it had gotten there. No one ever claimed it. But the curator of the collection, a serious woman with iron spectacles, added the item to her catalogue under a new label, unattributed artifact. Here, possible link to erased correspondences. She logged the entry, then paused. Curious? She murmured. She did not know Hercule Poirot, but she had just opened the next chapter. Chapter 11. The letters in the attic, the London sky had turned a soft, milky grey, the kind that promised neither rain nor sun, only the quiet weight of time. Hercule Poirot stood before a familiar townhouse on Upper Brook Street, his cane tapping lightly on the cobblestones. The house belonged to the late Sir Geoffrey Allendale, a name that had surfaced in the margins of the Linnell manuscript and now loomed once more in Poirot's mind. Clara Hastings joined him, her eyes scanning the brass plaque beside the heavy oak door. "Are you certain we're not chasing ghosts?" Poirot gave her a faint smile. "Mademoiselle, in my experience, ghosts are often the most honest witnesses." They were met at the door by Evelyn Allendale, Sir Geoffrey's niece and heir. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, with a librarian's precision and a soldier's posture. "My uncle never threw anything away," she said, as she led them through the musty corridors. "I imagine that's what you're hoping for." "Indeed," Poirot said, "particularly anything relating to his work with the Ministry of Information during the war." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "He kept those files locked, Monsieur Poirot, but after his death I boxed up everything in the attic. You're welcome to search, so long as nothing leaves the house." Poirot bowed. "You have my word. The attic was a kingdom of dust and secrets. Wooden beams loomed like ribs overhead, and the floor creaked with every step." Clara sneezed as she pulled open the first box, revealing folders labelled in faded ink. Censorship Division, 1941, Public Morale Reports, Unpublished Speeches. "Look at this," she murmured, holding up a folder titled Correspondence Classified. Authors. Poirot joined her. Inside were carbon copies of letters, many of them unsigned, others bearing only initials. Each letter referred obliquely to individuals considered a threat to narrative cohesion. Clara read one aloud. "We believe this voice will disrupt the preferred arc. Recommend early intervention or discouragement through peer channels." What does that even mean? Poirot tapped a note in the margin. "It means, mademoiselle, that certain truths were not merely silenced. They were edited out, like a story rewritten by invisible hands." As they sorted through the boxes, Clara found another item, a bundle of envelopes wrapped in twine, each addressed to J. Collingsworth, Brighton. The sender was simply marked A. "These are personal," she said, puzzled. "They're dated from 1947 to 1951, all after the war." Poirot opened one carefully. The handwriting was delicate, anxious. Inside, a message stood out. "They've turned the page, but they've not burned the book. It still lives, in pieces, in people. The end is a ruse." Clara shivered. "Do you think this A is one of the missing?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Or one who knew them? They spent the next few days tracing J. Collingsworth, John, it turned out, a once prominent literary critic who had vanished from the public sphere in 1953. According to an obituary in the Times, he had drowned off the coast of Sussex, though the body had never been recovered. Clara read the article aloud in Poirot's study. He was working on a collection titled The Unwritten Histories, detailing authors whose works had been lost or politely dismissed. Poirot leaned back, in his chair, eyes narrowed, a title too close to Linnell's manuscript to be coincidence. Clara looked up. Could they have known each other? I believe they may have worked together, or at the very least followed parallel paths. She laid the envelope on a table, the table. So, if Collingsworth died in 1953, who was A, and why send him these letters? Poirot's gaze moved to the mantelpiece, where the coin still rested. Perhaps A is not a single person. Perhaps it is a signature, used by those trying to preserve the truth. A society? Clara asked. A network, Poirot corrected, hidden beneath public life, writing in the margins of history. Later that evening, Clara knocked gently on Poirot's study door. I've been comparing the letters, she said, entering with a sheaf of papers, and something stood out. Look at the phrasing here. Page 42 must not fall into neglect. It contains the keystone. Poirot examined the letter. And? There's a similar note in one of Linnell's marginalia, Clara said, flipping through a scanned copy of the manuscript. See 42 for the fracture line. Poirot's brow furrowed. Page 42 of the manuscript? No, Clara said, of a manuscript, but not the one we've seen. Poirot stood abruptly. Mademoiselle, do you still have the inventory from the British Library? Clara nodded. Of course. Find any mention of a manuscript that disappeared in 1952. Something connected to Collingsworth, or to the same donation batch. Clara's fingers flew across her laptop. A moment later, she looked up. There's one. Accession number Store 2B. Never catalogued. Title unknown. Status. Pending review. Misplaced. Poirot smiled. Misplaced. How conveniently bureaucratic. Clara sat back. You think this page 42 is in that manuscript? I think it is the fracture point, the place where the true narrative split. And if we can find it, we may learn who orchestrated the grand silencing. And how to stop it. Poirot nodded. Yes, but more importantly, how to make the world remember. The next morning, they met with Dr. Lena Groves, the British Library's Director of Acquisitions. A stern woman in her 50s, she had the sharp gaze of someone used to catching lies. I'm aware of 742B, she said. We've looked for it. Nothing turns up. Frankly, I'm not sure it ever existed. Poirot opened the folder containing the letters. Then someone went to a great deal of trouble to pretend it did, including a coded reference in the archives and letters from a classified ministry operative. Groves glanced at the documents, her expression unreadable. Even if it did exist, why do you care? The war is long over. These are old ghosts, Poirot's tone sharpened. Because we are still living with the consequences, madame. And the erasure of truth is never old. It is merely delayed justice. There was a pause. Groves exhaled. There is one place we didn't search, the Overflow Archive, off-site. Poirot's eyes lit up. Then that is where we shall begin. They arrived at the off-site facility, an old warehouse on the edge of Croydon, under heavy rain. Inside, rows of boxes stretched like mausoleums of memory. The air smelled of damp paper and time. Hours passed. Poirot methodically checked each row. Clara catalogued box numbers. At last, in a neglected corner behind a toppled shelf, she found it, a plain brown folder, no label. Inside, a typescript manuscript, yellowed with age. On the first page, working title, The Collapse of the Central Narrative Author. J. Collingsworth, 1952. Clara turned to page 42. Her breath caught. It's a confession, she whispered. Names, timelines, how they coordinated the removal of dissenting authors, and this. She pointed. This references the man with the coin. Poirot leaned over her shoulder. Then we have found it. The fracture. The missing page. Carefully closed the folder. And now, mademoiselle, we must decide what to do with it. Clara looked at him. There's no doubt, is there? We publish. Poirot gave a slight bow. Then let us prepare. For every silenced page deserves its voice. Chapter 12. A Shadow in the Archives. The manuscript sat between them like a live wire. Even in the dusty air of the British Library's off-site archive, it hummed with tension. The collapse of the central narrative, J. Collingsworth's missing work, was more than historical documentation. It was a blueprint for manipulation. Hercule Poirot gently traced a gloved finger along the margin of page 42, where names, dates, and affiliations stood out in stark black ink. Clara Hastings watched in silence, the air thick with the weight of what they had uncovered. There are at least 17 figures listed here, she said. Half were editors or publishers. The others, civil servants, museum curators, even 2 literary agents. Poirot nodded. The architecture of erasure, mademoiselle. Very neat, very deliberate, and all hidden under layers of seemingly innocuous roles. And this name, Clara pointed to the bottom of the page, Alaric Vale. Poirot's eyes narrowed. I know it. He was director of the National Narrative Committee in 1951, oversaw a project called Cohesion for the Future, which we now know meant suppressing inconvenient voices, Clara murmured. Poirot glanced around. The vast rows of neglected archives seemed to press inward. Let us not tarry, he said. There may yet be others who do not wish this particular chapter to be rediscovered. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Clara spread out her notes while Poirot brewed a fresh tisane. On the table lay 2 dossiers, one on Alaric Vale, the other on the curator. You're sure they're not the same person? Clara asked. Poirot took his time before answering. No, they are not, but they are cut from the same cloth. Vale's ideology gave birth to the curator's method. He created the framework. The curator refined it into art. Clara frowned. So Vale was the architect. The curator became the editor. Très juste, Poirot said, and that makes the manuscript not only evidence, it makes it dangerous. Clara looked up. We have to tell someone. And we shall, but carefully. Not everyone will wish the truth unburied. There was a sudden knock at the door. Poirot stood immediately, eyes alert. Clara followed him into the foyer. He opened the door to find George, the building's porter, holding a sealed envelope. No, "Send her, sir," George said. "Delivered by hand." Poirot accepted it. The paper was fine, heavy. Inside, a single card, embossed with the emblem of the Royal Literary Society. The message read, "Certain narratives are protected for the stability of the cultural order. Disrupt that, and you risk more than reputations. We advise discretion. The Preservation Council." Clara read it aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "What in God's name is the Preservation Council?" Poirot's eyes were cold. The editors behind the editors. The ones who ensured authors, like Linnell and Collingsworth, vanished from public life. They believe in a curated reality, not a chaotic truth. Clara sat down slowly. "And they know we have the manuscript." "Yes, which means they are watching." That evening, Poirot and Clara met in secret with Dr. Lena Groves at a private reading room. She arrived alone, carrying a copy of the II Library's restricted list, materials redacted or denied cataloguing due to cultural incongruity. "I've never seen some of these titles," she said, laying the file flat, "and I've worked here 20 years. Poirot slid the Collingsworth manuscript toward her. "Then it is time you understood the full extent of the manipulation. You are in a position to act." Groves hesitated. "This could cause a scandal. The library would face questions we might not survive." "Et alors?" Poirot said sharply. "Let them ask. History does not wither when examined. Only lies do." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll review the manuscript, myself. If what you say is true, I'll initiate internal review and contact select journalists quietly." "Quietly is good," Clara said, "but not silently." The next morning, as Poirot and Clara prepared to meet with a historian at King's College, Clara noticed a figure lingering by the newsstand across the street. The same man had appeared near the archive site the day before. Tall, umbrella, overcoat too warm for the weather. "We're being followed," she said under her breath. Poirot gave a slight nod. "We expected it." As they crossed the street, Poirot slowed near the man and tapped his cane. "Pardon, monsieur," he said cheerfully, "but you have an unfortunate habit of walking exactly 12 paces behind me." The man smiled politely. "Coincidence, I'm sure." Poirot leaned in. "Tell your employer that if anything happens to the manuscript or to Mademoiselle Hastings, the truth will be published through every outlet I know." With names, the smile faded. "I will," the man said, and disappeared into the crowd. Clara exhaled. "Do you think he'll listen?" "None. But he will hesitate. And that is enough, for now." At King's College, Dr. Marion Knox, an expert on wartime propaganda, welcomed them into her office with cautious enthusiasm. "I've reviewed the first 20 pages of Collingsworth's manuscript," she said. "It's explosive, but it aligns disturbingly well with what I've suspected for years." "You believe in the central narrative theory?" Clara asked. Knox nodded. "Yes. The war changed more than politics. It restructured how we tell stories, what gets published, funded, reviewed. Those who didn't fit the new mould were erased subtly." Poirot sat forward. "Then we are not imagining this." "Far from it. I even found a suppressed interview with Alaric Vale, done weeks before his retirement in 1956. In it, he admits to commissioning counter-literature programs, to neutralize narrative threats. Where is the interview now? Poirot asked. In a private archive, Knox said, but I can get you a copy. That night, Poirot could not sleep. The fire crackled gently, but his mind was elsewhere. On Vale, on the curator, on all the silenced voices reaching out from the margins of time. He rose and walked to the desk. There he opened a small leather-bound notebook. On its pages he had begun drafting his own account of the investigation, not for publication, but for memory. The title read, "The Last Page and What Followed." He wrote, "The work of restoration is never glamorous. It is quiet, tedious, often thankless, but it matters. Because history, like a puzzle, only makes sense when all the pieces are visible, even the one someone tried to hide." 2 days later, an envelope arrived. No name. Inside, a copy of the Alaric Vale interview, transcribed and marked, classified until 2045. Clara read it aloud. "We had to choose cohesion over chaos. Some truths divide more than lies. We trimmed the edges so the centre could hold. I regret nothing, not even Linnell. He chose irrelevance." Poirot's jaw tightened. "No, Monsieur Vale, you chose silence. He chose dignity." He turned to Clara. "We publish everything." Clara nodded. "Let's finish the book." Chapter 13. The Vale Protocol. The morning air was sharp, and a cold wind scraped across the Thames as Hercule Poirot and Clara Hastings crossed the footbridge towards the south bank. Beneath them, the river churned, a grey ribbon reflecting the unsettled mood hanging over London. Their destination, a private archive housed beneath the Royal Festival Hall. It was here, Clara had learned, that Alaric Vale's personal papers had been sealed after his abrupt disappearance in 1957. The archive was overseen by the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, and technically the materials were off-limits to the public. But Poirot, with his impeccable credentials and an invitation extended via a reluctant Dr. Groves, was no ordinary visitor. "We're only allowed 30 minutes, Clara said as they entered the security checkpoint. "And no photographs." Poirot adjusted his gloves. "That will be sufficient. A man like Vale leaves his fingerprints on everything. We need only find the clearest print." They were led through a series of cold concrete corridors into a chamber lined with narrow drawers and acid-free boxes. Their guide, a silent clerk in a navy waistcoat, unlocked one of the cabinets and withdrew a single folder. File, Nortus Evu 349 Internal Correspondence, 1949 to 1956. Clara opened the folder and scanned its contents. "There are letters," she whispered, typed, signed AV. "Some are addressed to officials in the Home Office. Others look like they went to private publishing firms." Poirot leaned closer. "Read one aloud, if you please." She cleared her throat and began. February 2nd, 1951. To Marcus Hillingford, Editorial Director, Regnum Press Marcus. The individual known as E.L. has proven persistent. His manuscript, while not inflammatory in tone, carries the seeds of dissension, embedded in structure, metaphor, and silence. I recommend the application of Protocol B3. Should he resist, deploy the standard delay. A.V. Clara looked up. E.L. must be Edward Linnell. Poirot nodded. And Protocol B3? She turned the page. A typed sheet bore the heading, Preservation, Directive, Veil Protocols, B Classification. Poirot read silently, lips moving. 3. Neutralization via isolation. Remove subject from peer discussion networks. Redirect reviews to conflicting subjects. Employ generous neglect tactics. Maintain plausible deniability. Clara whispered, They cut him off. Made him disappear without confrontation. A kind of intellectual suffocation. Poirot's expression darkened. And this was not unique. Look here. He held up another letter. March 9, 1952. To Committee of Cultural Continuity. The manuscript titled The Collapse of the Central Narrative must not be allowed into circulation. Its premise challenges the post-war consensus. If submitted to any reviewing body, activate Veil Protocol C1, acquisition and burial. Clara's breath caught. That's Collingsworth's book. Yes, Poirot said softly. They didn't just suppress it. They buried it, catalogued the grave, and then hid the map. They continued reading. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she sifted through correspondence bearing the names of authors long forgotten. Poets, historians, playwrights, all identified as narrative contaminants. This is the record of an intellectual purge, she said, not by fire or banning, but by silence. Poirot nodded. A quieter tyranny, but no less dangerous. The clerk returned. Time's up. Poirot rose, bowing slightly. Merci. We have seen enough. Outside the wind had risen. Clara hugged her coat tighter as they walked along the embankment. We need to compile everything. Linnell's manuscript, Collingsworth's text, Vale's letters, into one volume, she said. It needs to be airtight, cross-referenced, annotated. Poirot gave a small smile. You are thinking like a publisher, mademoiselle. I used to be one, she said, before I lost my faith in the system. And now I think we can change it. Poirot's smile deepened. Bon, then let us begin. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, they set to work. Poirot organized the documents into categories. Erased voices, mechanisms of silence, the veil protocols, and the resurfacing. Clara compiled annotations and contextual notes for each document. Where references appeared vague, she tracked down contemporaneous reviews, letters, and meeting records. She sent coded messages to two journalists she trusted, one in Paris, the other in Edinburgh, hinting at a forthcoming revelation in the literary world. They worked late into the night. At one point, Poirot paused, gazing at the fire. Do you know, mademoiselle, he said quietly, I once believed that truth, like a well-written mystery, would always out itself. That logic and order would uncover it, no matter how deeply hidden. Clara looked up. And now? Now I see that truth must be fought for, guarded, even revived when buried. She smiled softly. We're almost there. The following day, a courier delivered a parcel addressed to Poirot. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a single coin, the same kind the curator had once left as his calling card. But this one had been cracked in half. A note accompanied it. There are some silences we will no longer maintain. Finish what must be finished. A fellow editor, Clara, stared at the note. What does that mean? Is the curator helping us now? Poirot turned the coin in his hand. No, this is not from the curator. This is from someone within their circle. Someone who's defected. A whistleblower. A truth keeper, Poirot said. One who has tired of trimming the page. Clara's eyes lit up. Then we're not alone. 2 weeks later, their compilation, titled The Vanishing Page, Suppression and the Literary War, was ready. They presented it to Dr. Groves and Dr. Knox in a private meeting room at King's College. The two women read in silence for nearly an hour. When Groves looked up, her voice was firm. "This changes everything." Knox added, "We'll release it as a joint academic public work, peer-reviewed but accessible. It will be controversial, but unignorable." Poirot inclined his head. "Let the world decide once all the pages are returned to the book." That evening, Poirot stood at his window, gazing out across London. Lights blinked like scattered stars, and the city moved beneath him unaware. Clara joined him, holding a cup of tea. "It's strange," she said. "We haven't solved a murder. We haven't arrested anyone. And yet it feels finished." Poirot nodded slowly. "Sometimes justice is not the ending. It is the restoration, the setting right of a crooked tale." Clara raised her teacup. "To Linnell, to Collingsworth, to every vanished page." Poirot raised his tisane. "Et à ceux qui écoutent encore." They drank in silence. Somewhere across the city, a printing press began to roll. Chapter 14. The Book Without a Shelf. The morning after The Vanishing Page was quietly uploaded to select academic repositories, Clara Hastings sat alone in her flat, watching the download counter tick upward. Dozens of views in minutes, then hundreds, then thousands. She sipped her coffee, unsure whether to feel exhilarated or terrified. She wasn't alone for long. Her phone buzzed. "Poirot, bon matin, Mademoiselle Hastings. May I request the pleasure of your company at the Café Le Monde? There is a small storm brewing in literary circles, and I would like to discuss it over pain au chocolat." Clara smiled. "I'm on my way." When she arrived, Poirot was already seated at a corner table by the window, impeccably dressed in a navy suit and silk cravat. A folded copy of the Times Literary Supplement lay beside his plate. Clara sat down, brushing the cold from her coat. "Well?" Poirot handed her the paper. "Third page, middle column." She read aloud. "In a stunning act of archival revelation, a document titled The Vanishing Page, compiled by independent researchers and literary scholars, alleges systemic suppression of post-war literary voices through covert government and editorial mechanisms. If verified, the claims may reshape our understanding of mid-century British literature." "They use the word revelation," Clara murmured. Poirot smiled. "They are being cautious, but the thread has been pulled, and now the tapestry begins to unweave." Clara's phone buzzed again. A message from Dr. Knox. "We've been asked for interviews by The Guardian, BBC4, and a literary podcast hosted by Zadie Marsh. We're scheduling cautiously. Be ready." Clara looked up. "It's happening, isn't it?" Poirot leaned forward. "The truth rarely arrives with fanfare, mademoiselle, but it makes itself known, like the morning sun, slowly, steadily, and in its light some prefer to retreat." Midday, backlash had begun. One prominent columnist in the Daily Beacon dismissed the work as conspiracy dressed in academia, while an anonymous op-ed in the editorialist warned of dangerous revisionism. But others, especially younger writers, professors and independent critics, took to social media, quoting passages from the letters of Alaric Vale, citing the Vale Protocols, and demanding institutional responses from the British Library and the Ministry of Culture. At 3:42 p.m, the Royal Literary Society issued a brief, carefully worded statement. We recognise the right of scholars and citizens alike to interrogate literary history. We are reviewing the documents presented in the vanishing page and will cooperate with any relevant oversight body. That's bureaucratic speak for "we're cornered," Clara said, as she and Poirot walked along the river that afternoon. Poirot chuckled. They will stall, yes, perhaps even attempt to discredit, but the page has been turned, and it cannot be unturned. That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot received an envelope, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was a single sheet with 3 words in clean block script. The curator watches. Poirot turned the message in his hand. Dramatic, he said aloud. Clara, reading over his shoulder, frowned. I thought we were past this. Didn't the curator vanish after the archives incident? Perhaps not, Poirot said. Or perhaps someone else has picked up the title. A curator of suppression can be replaced, much like a librarian. He tucked the paper into his drawer. But it does confirm one thing. Someone is rattled. The following day, Clara was invited to speak at a panel discussion hosted by a student literary society at King's College. She hesitated at first, then accepted. The lecture hall was fuller than expected. Students, professors and journalists sat shoulder to shoulder. Some held printed copies of the vanishing page, dog-eared and marked with coloured tabs. Clara stepped up to the podium, heart racing. She began not with Vale or Linnell, but with a memory. When I was 24, she said, I worked for a small press. I found a manuscript I loved. Fragmentary, strange, a bit uneven, but haunting. My editor rejected it, saying it didn't fit the season's narrative direction. I didn't understand then. I do now. She paused, then continued. We like to believe stories are chosen for quality, for resonance, for necessity, but sometimes they're chosen for silence. She outlined the Collingsworth manuscript, the buried letters, the insidious elegance of the Vale Protocols. Then she said, we have always trusted that the book on the shelf is the book that matters. But there are books without shelves, authors without reviews, pages never read. She ended with a challenge. Find them. Ask why. Ask who benefits when a voice vanishes. When the applause came, it was long and thunderous. That night, as Poirot sat reading by the fire, Clara returned to Whitehaven Mansions, cheeks flushed with wind and excitement. You were magnificent, Poirot said without looking up. I'm beginning to understand, she replied. This case, it was never about a single vanished manuscript. It was about the machinery that decides what history remembers. Poirot nodded. And now the machinery has been exposed. He stood, crossed to his desk, and pulled out a folder. There is one last piece. He handed it to her. Inside, a photocopy of a handwritten letter, dated March 5th, 1957, signed by Edward Linnell. They have taken my words from the shelves, but they have not taken them from me. I will leave them where someone brave may find them. Not in libraries, but in the stories that survive in memory, in myth, in the quiet defiance of readers who still believe truth is worth the trouble. Clara blinked back tears. We found him. Poirot's voice was gentle. We. And now others will too. The next morning, something remarkable happened. A small independent bookshop in Bloomsbury placed The Vanishing Page in its front window, then another. By afternoon, copies appeared in cafes, co-working spaces, and university bulletin boards. It became not a bestseller, but something rarer. A whisper campaign that worked. Readers who had never heard of Linnell began seeking out his poems. Collingsworth's name trended online, and someone launched a website archiving vanished authors, with an open call for stories and manuscripts buried by time or design. On the final day of October, Poirot and Clara returned to the British Library, not as investigators, but as guests. A new exhibit had opened, Lost Voices, the literature that almost was. At the entrance, a placard bore words by Edward Linnell. Not all stories survive intact. Some arrive fractured, burned, buried. But if you find even a single word worth remembering, rescue it. Poirot stood before the plaque in silence. Then he turned to Clara. We have done well, mon ami. Clara smiled. It's not finished, but it's begun. Poirot adjusted his tie, eyes twinkling. Then let us read on. Chapter 15. The Quiet Bestseller. The autumn rain swept across London like a weary sigh. In a small bookstore tucked between a florist and a tailor's shop in Soho, the bell above the door jingled as readers entered. Not for the newest thriller, but for something older, quieter, rediscovered. The Vanishing Page had become a kind of whisper bestseller. No marketing, no television interviews, no stickers declaring must read. And yet, the reprinted copies sold out weekly. Even more remarkable, people stayed to talk. Book clubs formed. A small reading room in Camden dedicated an entire week to authors once disappeared. In Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot read the reviews with his usual calm. An indictment of the silencing impulse embedded in post-war publishing, he murmured. Not only a triumph of scholarship, but a moral reckoning with the curation of cultural memory. He folded the paper. Modest, no? Clara Hastings smiled from the armchair across from him, a steaming cup of cocoa in her hands. We made an entire generation look at the back of the bookshelf. Poirot raised an eyebrow, and there they found Edward Linnell. Blinking in the light, she nodded. And perhaps even Collingsworth. Someone claimed to find a surviving chapter of the collapse of the central narrative in their grandmother's attic. Scanned and posted it online. Let us hope the grandmother was not also buried in protocol. She laughed. It's strange. We started with a missing manuscript. We ended up finding an entire buried history. Poirot stood and walked to the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. History is rarely lost, mademoiselle. More often, it is tucked away by those who fear it. Later that week, a peculiar invitation arrived. Clara opened the envelope while Poirot prepared his breakfast. The paper was thick, almost parchment. The handwriting looping and refined. Monsieur Poirot and Miss Hastings, you are cordially invited to an exclusive gathering of literary curators, editors, and scholars. An open conversation about the ethics of cultural preservation will be held at Roseville Manor this Saturday at dusk. Your presence is requested. No recorders, no press. The circle of quiet pages. Clara read it aloud, then raised an eyebrow. The circle of what? Poirot's brow furrowed. They have branded themselves now. How stylish. Should we go? He turned back to his eggs. Of course. The moment one claims to protect the truth in private, they are already compromised. It is the oldest trick. Conceal the control in the guise of curation. She folded the letter. Then we'll attend. Roseville Manor lay on the outskirts of Oxford. A sombre Georgian estate nestled in the trees, its long drive lined with wet gravel and high hedges. Clara and Poirot arrived just before dusk. A valet took their coats and ushered them into a vaulted hall filled with polished wood and flickering candles. There were about 24 guests. Many wore conservative suits or long dark coats. Some Clara recognized from panels and footnotes. Editors, professors, archivists. Others were anonymous, but their body language suggested confidence and influence. At the front of the hall, a woman stepped forward. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear and deliberate. Thank you for coming. My name is Dr. Beatrice Mornell. I was once the last chair of the Vale Committee. Gasps fluttered across the room. Yes, she said, it was real. And yes, we retired it voluntarily in 1972. But its legacy remained. Hidden mechanisms, silent refusals, the illusion of choice. Poirot stepped forward. Then you admit it? The existence of Vale's protocols? The burying of voices? I do, and I regret it. A hush fell. She continued. That is why we are here tonight. Not to defend the past, but to choose whether we continue it. A younger man, bespectacled and severe, raised his hand with, Respect, Dr. Mornell. The vanishing page has already made us pariahs. If we publicly admit what we did, what we protected, we dismantle the last wall between scholarship and scandal. And perhaps, Clara said quietly, stepping beside Poirot, that wall was built not for protection, but for concealment. Another voice chimed in. But if everything is allowed, if every voice, no matter how wild or dissonant, finds the same platform, do we not risk literary chaos? Poirot's gaze sharpened. You fear chaos, monsieur. I fear homogeneity. A garden in which only roses are allowed to grow may be beautiful, but it is not nature, and it cannot feed the soul. There was silence. Then Mornell nodded. Let us vote. Publicly. No secrets. They voted. 17 voted in favour of full disclosure, releasing the remaining Vale documents, declassifying every author buried under protocols B and C. 5 abstained. 2 voted against. It was done. 3 days later, the Roseville Declaration was published on the websites of every major university press in the UK. We, the undersigned, acknowledge the systemic editorial suppression undertaken during the mid-20th century and beyond. We commit to releasing the archival material pertaining to said actions and restoring authors and works previously suppressed under the Vale Protocols to public view and literary consideration. In the days that followed, archives opened, redacted names were unveiled, forgotten texts were scanned and made free, Journals announced special issues focused on the lost generation of letters. Clara stood in front of the display window at Daunt Books one afternoon, watching people pass by a new section labelled Recovered Works. Inside were copies of Edward, Linnell's poems, reissued under the title Leaves They Tried to Burn, alongside essays from newly recovered authors and an early version of The Collapse of the Central Narrative, edited with footnotes and commentary. She turned to see Poirot standing behind her. "Well?" he asked. She breathed in, then let it out slowly. "It's actually happening." Poirot smiled faintly. "Justice, mademoiselle, is not always a gavel or a prison. Sometimes it is simply the right name on the right shelf." That night, they returned to Whitehaven Mansions. Clara settled on the sofa, curling her legs beneath her. Poirot stood by the window, the city alight beneath them. "There is something that still troubles me," Clara said. "We exposed the truth. But what about the curator? We never unmasked them." Poirot turned slowly. "Perhaps we never will. But don't you want to know who was behind it? Who orchestrated the silencing?" "I do," he said. "But perhaps what matters more is that the silencing has ended. The identity of the jailer is less important when the door stands open." Clara nodded, but her brow remained furrowed. "Still, it feels unfinished." Poirot tilted his head. "Then perhaps there is one more chapter left." She looked up. "You think they'll strike again?" He smiled faintly. "Let us say, I suspect there are still pages unaccounted for." He crossed to his bookshelf and removed a slim volume, old and worn. He opened it and slipped out a folded sheet, yellowed with time. Clara leaned in. "Is that—" Poirot handed it to her. It was a note, scrawled in faded ink. Not all pages were lost. Some were simply waiting for the right reader. E.L. She looked up, wide-eyed. "Where did you get this?" Poirot sipped his tisane. "It arrived the day after the archives opened. No return address, no explanation." Clara smiled, eyes shining. "So, Linnell knew all along?" Poirot nodded. "Some authors, mademoiselle, do not write to be read immediately. They write for when the world is ready." Chapter 16. The Last Acknowledgement. The British Library buzzed with a quiet energy, not unlike that of a newly opened crime scene. Gone were the days of silent near-sacred reading rooms and velvet ropes. Now, researchers in cardigans rubbed shoulders with journalists clutching microphones, and graduate students photographed newly unsealed archives with reverence. Clara Hastings stood at the centre of the Rose Reading Room, leafing carefully through a set of correspondence recently made public. On the surface, they were routine. Letters between publishers, editorial notes, publication schedules. But between the lines lay breadcrumbs. Censorship passed off as selectivity, strategic delays masked as seasonal alignment. Across the room, Poirot observed her, hands tucked behind his back, moustache immaculate. "You read them like confessionals," he murmured as he approached. "They are," she replied. "Only the authors never knew they were confessing." She turned a page. "Listen to this one. July 12, 1954. The manuscript's tone is not in keeping with the national spirit. Better to delay until climate improves. That's how they buried Edward Linnell's grey morning, thin light. Not rejected, postponed, indefinitely. Poirot nodded solemnly. Ah, the art of bureaucratic silence, the non-answer that becomes the grave. Clara looked up. Why did they do it, Poirot? Was it fear, or something worse, convenience? He considered. Perhaps both, but also pride. The belief that their own taste equalled truth. Outside, the day was grey and gusty. The newly planted trees in the courtyard swayed like they were whispering to each other. Clara and Poirot exited the library, each lost in thought. They strolled past the row of cafes where students now argued over forgotten novels with passionate intensity. In the window of a bookshop across the street, a chalkboard displayed, "This month's theme, suppressed genius." Clara stopped to admire the stack of books below it. Do you think Linnell would have wanted this? The attention? The legacy? Poirot smiled. He left pages to be found. That is an invitation, not a retreat. Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced down and frowned. It's Dr. Knox. She says someone's left an anonymous document in the Institute's postbox. Typewritten, no signature, labelled Addendum to the Vale Papers. Poirot's eyes twinkled. At last, the final footnote. That afternoon, in the Institute's modest archival room, Clara laid the new document across the table. The paper was coarse, yellowed by time, but the ink was crisp. The title was plain, Addendum 5th, Acknowledgement Protocol. Clara read aloud, should the suppressed author become posthumously recognized due to public or critical interest, the committee may, in rare cases, issue an acknowledgement letter. This is to be deposited in the National Archive, under a sealed designation, not to be opened until the 75th anniversary of the author's death. The letter is to be signed only the committee. Poirot frowned. So they not only buried the voices, but prepared eulogies for when the world grew hungry again. Clara turned the pages. At the end, a short list of names: Linnell, Collingsworth, Diana Keel, Samir Abbas, Ruth Valence. I recognize only 2 of them, she said. Poirot nodded. Which means the rest were nearly erased. A small handwritten note was stapled to the final page. The script was spidery, elegant. Some truths refused to stay buried. Others waited patiently. B.M. Beatrice Mornell, Clara whispered. She must have deposited this quietly, maybe years ago. Poirot's voice was soft, a final act of contrition. They returned to Whitehaven Mansions late in the evening. The lamps cast a warm glow across the walls, illuminating the spines of Poirot's beloved detective novels. Clara settled into her favourite armchair. We should publish this addendum. Let people see how far the committee went, even in secrecy. Poirot poured himself a tisane. Yes, but do so with care. These truths, though valuable, may still wound. He sat beside her. There is something elegant about the acknowledgement letter. An admission written in expectation of being forgiven. But it also reeks of cowardice. Clara looked up. Do you think the curator was real? A person? Or just an idea? Poirot considered. The curator was always more than one person. It was a role, passed down. Just as one might pass down a key to a vault, no one is meant to open. He paused, then smiled faintly. But you opened it, mademoiselle, and you let the light in. 3 weeks later, Clara stood at a podium in Cambridge's Great Hall. The Festival of Lost Literature was in full swing. 3 days of panels, exhibits, and staged readings. She held a copy of Grey Morning, Thin Light in her hand. This, she said to the gathered crowd, was a book deemed inappropriate for its time, too quiet, too introspective, too unpatriotic. She paused, turning a page. Today, it is studied for its stark beauty and its brave melancholy. It survived not because someone preserved it, but because someone found it. That someone might be you. She stepped away from the microphone to thunderous applause. Among the crowd, Poirot watched in silence, his hands gently folded in front of him. Later, in the hotel lounge, Clara and Poirot shared a pot of tea. She handed him a slim envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "The Royal Society of Literature," she said. "They're awarding you a medal for services to literary justice." Poirot chuckled. "How very dramatic. But I did not write a single word." "You helped us recover hundreds." He opened the envelope, scanned the contents and nodded. "Then I accept, but only if they serve lemon cake at the ceremony." Clara laughed. "I'll make sure of it." As the night deepened, Clara stepped out onto the hotel's balcony. The moon was pale, the city humming quietly below. Poirot joined her, the crisp night air brushing past them. "We've restored voices," Clara said. "But what now? There are always more stories lost, more pages torn away." Poirot looked into the distance. "Then you must keep reading, keep asking, keep following the missing sentences." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Chapter 17. The Ink Beneath the Erasure London, Late Spring. The air smelled of rain-washed stone and cherry blossoms clinging to the edges of Bloomsbury's winding streets. Inside a quiet study lined with aged maps and brittle editions, Hercule Poirot sat in perfect stillness, the letter in his hand trembling slightly, though his fingers did not. It had arrived without ceremony. No wax seal, no watermark, just an ordinary envelope slipped under the door of Whitehaven Mansions. Clara Hastings stood near the window, watching the late afternoon light slant through the clouds. "Well?" she asked after a silence that stretched nearly a minute. Poirot did not look up. "It is from the curator." Clara turned. "You're sure?" He held up the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, precise, and like the author, devoid of flourish. Just facts, just ink, a letter meant to survive. Poirot read aloud. "Monsieur Poirot, you have taken apart what many spent lifetimes constructing. Brick by brick, page by page. Do not mistake my silence for defeat. The curator is not a person. The curator is an idea. And ideas, as you well know, are more difficult to erase than names from catalogues. You ask why we silenced. The better question is, why did no one stop us sooner?" See, Poirot set the letter down gently. Clara crossed the room, picked it up, and reread it. "So, that's it? A philosophical shrug from the shadows?" Poirot shook his head. "It is a warning, or perhaps an invitation." She raised an eyebrow. "To what? To vigilance?" The next morning, Clara received an email from the National Archive. During the cataloguing of declassified material, a sealed trunk had been discovered in a sub-basement. The contents bore Linnell's name. They arrived to inspect it later that day, an iron-bound chest locked with a rusted mechanism. After 3 failed attempts with the master key, Poirot simply tapped the side, leaned in, and turned the latch counterclockwise twice. It clicked open. Inside, manuscripts, longhand drafts, notebooks covered in weathered leather. But at the very bottom, tucked beneath a folded linen handkerchief, lay something far more unusual. A ledger labelled Curatorial Index, 1948 to 1962. Clara gasped. This lists everything. Not just what they suppressed, but who decided, who signed off. Poirot's eyes narrowed, the ink beneath the erasure. The discovery made headlines across the literary world. The final proof, the veil, lifted. For decades, the debate had centered on inference. Was there truly a structure of cultural gatekeeping beyond editorial taste? The ledger confirmed it all. A clandestine committee, funded quietly through state literary grants, a tiered protocol system. Authors reviewed for ideological compliance. Notes like too mournful for peacetime, or would disturb the domestic reader. But what shocked Clara most were the names at the bottom of the approval chain. Respected editors, even a future laureate. They built their legacies, she whispered, on the silence of others. Poirot gently closed the ledger. Even a pristine library has blood in its mortar, mademoiselle. The final weeks of spring passed quickly. Clara was invited to give lectures, consult on restorations, even design a new digital archive. The reclaimed shelf, a searchable database of suppressed literature, with notes on recovery history, restoration status, and open investigations. Poirot, ever fond of order, insisted on indexing the works alphabetically and by theme. Should the collapse of the central narrative be under C or T? Clara teased one afternoon. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Under I, naturellement. She blinked. What? For iconoclasm, that is what Collingsworth attempted. She smiled and added a new tag. On the first day of summer, Clara visited the grave of Edward Linnell. It was modest. A flat stone, no grand epitaph. Just his name and the dates. Someone had left a fountain pen, uncapped, beside a folded page of his poetry. She read it aloud, wind tugging at her coat. You were never meant to find me whole. The story lives in its undoing. Not the chorus, but the unsung. Not the answer, but the ache. As she tucked the poem back into its envelope, she noticed something else. A small metal plaque at the base of the stone. Newly affixed, acknowledged. The circle disbanded. Clara stared at it, unsure whether to feel closure or betrayal. Later, she told Poirot, they're trying to rewrite their own part now. Control the redemption. He nodded. History does not just belong to the victors. Mademoiselle, it belongs to the editors. She frowned. But we can fight that. We already are. On a warm June evening, Whitehaven Mansions was quiet. Clara sat at Poirot's desk, organizing her final notes for an article titled Beyond Erasure, The Ethics of Literary Recovery. Poirot entered with 2 cups of tisane. For the author and the archivist. She took hers gratefully. It's strange. This all began with a single missing page. Now we've traced an entire system. And still, I wonder if we've only scratched the surface. Poirot sat beside her. The truth, mademoiselle, is never tidy. It unravels slowly, like a thread caught in a drawer. Clara took a sip. You think there's more? I think, he said, there always is. He handed her an envelope. This arrived today. No return address, but the paper, it is American. She opened it carefully. Inside, a clipping from a Chicago literary magazine, dated 1971. An anonymous article titled, The Ones We Never Published. Beneath it a scrawled note. London was not alone. Try Denver, San Francisco, Buenos Aires. There are more pages waiting. A friend of the forgotten. Clara looked up, astonished. This is global. Poirot smiled faintly. Then we are not yet finished. That night Clara wrote a final entry in her journal. The mystery of the last page is not that it went missing. It is that we stopped looking for it, but now we know the ink still lingers. And as long as we read, we can recover it.